Heart and circulatory diseases are the leading cause of death globally. According to the Lancet's Global Burden of Disease, heart disease ranks as the biggest killer amongst everything else. And if you do talk about heart disease, cholesterol isn't too far behind in any discussion. But as a pro, when a routine blood test came back showing a slightly elevated cholesterol level, I was surprised. At the time, I was in my 20s, I was leading an active life, riding my bike lots, obviously, and I felt pretty healthy. So I guess naively, I didn't pay it too much attention. Recently though, I have been thinking about it more and dwelling on it. Should I perhaps be more worried than I am? To find out, I've enlisted the help of cardiologist Professor Daniel Augustine and dietitian Nicole Rubenstein. Are there changes that I, and perhaps you, can make now to guard our health well into the future? Cardiologist Professor Daniel Augustine is Medical Director of Sports Cardiology UK. I reached out to him because he's perfectly placed to explain exactly what high cholesterol is and the risks associated with it. My first port of call though, before I met him, was actually to get a blood test to find out my own current cholesterol levels and what those results might mean. I then arranged to meet him close to GCN HQ to find out more. Dan, thanks so much for being here and talking to us today. I'm really interested to get your take on this topic. I think first and foremost, I'd love to get your explanation on what high cholesterol actually is.
Yeah, thanks, Conor. And so total cholesterol is in all cells of our body. And actually, I guess the important bit to start on is that cholesterol is a really important part of our physiology. So it's an important part of all of our cells. It makes up some of our cell membranes, so it's really important for the structure of our cells. It's also really important in the synthesis of some important hormones like estrogen, testosterone, vitamin D, also important in the synthesis of bile salts, so to get rid of fats actually. So actually having the right amount of the correct type of cholesterol is important to living. Where we come on to heart health is thinking about what is the wrong amount of cholesterol to have and what is the wrong composition of cholesterol to have, and that's key here. So when you think about total cholesterol, so the total cholesterol in your body, that's broadly speaking made up of two forms. So you've got your good cholesterol, which is your HDL cholesterol, and that stands for high density lipoprotein. So that's the cholesterol that is whizzed off to the liver, and then the liver breaks it down and it's excreted. And then you've got your bad form of cholesterol, which is your LDL cholesterol, and that stands for low density lipoprotein. And that's the type that hangs around more in your arterial system, so your heart arteries, and it's a risk factor for things like heart attacks and strokes. And if we think about total cholesterol and where it comes from within our body, there are two main sources. One is it's naturally made within our liver, because as I've mentioned, we need it in terms of our function and our physiology. And then the other source is what we take in via foods. And if we think about foods, and I know you're going to be speaking to a nutritionist, there are three main types of fats within foods. So the bad forms are your saturated fats or your trans fats. So your saturated fats are high in large volumes of things like red meat and cheese, and the trans fats are in things like your takeaways and processed foods. And the good form is your unsaturated fats. So they're really common in things like olive oil, certain seeds like sesame seeds, certain nuts, certain oily fishes like salmon and mackerel.
And Dan, in terms of having high cholesterol and something that when it gets to a point you need to be worried about, how common is that in the general population?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's probably more common than either of us would have expected. So the most recent set of data from NHS Digital would suggest that in England, in adults over the age of 16, the prevalence is about 59%.
Wow.
Having high cholesterol. It obviously varies depending on your demographics, so your age and your gender, slightly higher in females than males, and higher as you get older, particularly after the age of 45. But as a startling statistic, and if you go around the world, it can be as high as 80% in some demographics.
That's incredible. I mean, what kind of got it started for me in terms of thinking about cholesterol? So when I was racing, I would have to get kind of quarterly blood tests. And one of those tests, it was like marked, highlighted in red, like high cholesterol, which is kind of surprised me because it's not something I'd ever really thought of as being something I should be aware of. I was young, I was healthy, I was very active. And I've come here today, I've had some more tests done, thanks to yourself. So I'm interested to go through those actually and just see what those results show and see if I do still have high cholesterol. I'm not sure.
Absolutely. So if we look back to your results from 2019, the red flag, as you said, was your total cholesterol, which was 5.1, normal being around 5 or so. So we're only just over that threshold. But what's really important when we look at anyone's lipid profile, particularly people who haven't had proven vascular events, so people who haven't had heart attacks or strokes, what we have to look at is what the breakdown of that total cholesterol is. And that's really important because the total cholesterol is the sum of your bad cholesterol plus your good cholesterol. So you may have a scenario like yourself actually, where you have more good cholesterol than the average person, and you have the normal amount of bad cholesterol, and that is what pushes your total cholesterol up. So that's not a bad thing, actually. So what you need to do is actually take a step back from that red number. It's easy to be drawn into the red, isn't it? Take a step back and actually look at the breakdown of the cholesterol, and that will give you a more accurate reflection of your overall heart health with regards to your lipid profile.
Okay, and in terms of today and where I stand with my most recent results, is it still the case that I don't need to be worried?
It's still good. It's still very good. And if we go through some of the results here that we've taken, so we've done a full lipid profile. So the total cholesterol was 4.6, and we're looking for anywhere under 5. But the important thing, again, as I stressed before, is that we need to look at the breakdown between how much of that total cholesterol is good and how much is bad. And you've got the optimal amount of good HDL cholesterol. It's about 1.6. We know between 1.4 and 1.6 is probably the optimal amount for cardiovascular health. And actually having really high numbers probably doesn't add that much to your overall risk reduction with regards to your lipid profile. We also did your bad cholesterol, your LDL cholesterol, that was around 2.7. So we're looking for a value of less than 3. And so that's well within normal limits. The other thing we look at when we think about treating people who haven't had cardiac events is something called their cholesterol to HDL ratio. So that's your ratio of your total cholesterol to the good cholesterol, and yours was fine. It was around 3 or so. And then when we look at your triglyceride levels, so I haven't mentioned triglycerides. So triglyceride is a different form of a fat, and it's a bad fat. It's like LDL. So you higher amounts gives you a worse prognosis, and we should be aiming for a total triglyceride of less than 2.3 there or thereabouts, and yours was 0.5, so well down. And if we take that a step further, so what do we do with the results as a cardiologist? What do we do with the cholesterol results? So the first thing is to break them down, not just take the total cholesterol, look at the breakdown. And then we have to think about, am I treating you for primary prevention or secondary prevention?
Okay. And I mean, I'm relieved that my results are okay. You mentioned there people had like kind of wildly high lipid profile. How common is that in amongst the general population? Because like, how common is it to see someone who is fit and healthy, maybe rides their bike a lot, takes care of their diet, and still has a profile that you need to worry about?
Yeah, really good question. So the incidence of familial hyperlipidemia, so a genetic cause, is in the order of 1 in 250 to 1 in 400.
Okay.
Relatively common in the grand schemes of population stuff. So who should be worried? So I think anyone over the age of 40 should take the onus to know what their lipid profile is, definitely, because we know that unfortunately adverse cardiac events during sports participation or for elite and even recreational athletes over the age of 40, they're driven by coronary events, so heart attacks and things like that. And that is all based upon what your own cardiac risk is. So everyone, I would be urging to know what their own cholesterol is by the age of 40, because what we know and what's clear from the screening data we know is that under the age of 35, cardiac death in sports participants is different to those over the age of 35 and 40. So in the older population, it's more due to coronary issues. In the younger population, it's more due to heart muscle issues or electrical issues.
Yeah, so a definite reminder, I think, for all of us to kind of pay attention to our own health and what's going on underneath the hood, so to speak. And you obviously mentioned the risk factors and what's kind of at stake here. What are the key risk factors when it comes to high cholesterol and heart health?
Yeah, so key risk factors for heart health are the ones that we've mentioned. So high blood pressure, diabetes, smoking, your family history, so your genetics, which you can't control, and your high cholesterol. In terms of the high cholesterol, then you're looking at your lifestyle and your diet. Can you reduce your weight? Can you alter your diet? Can you have more unsaturated fats? And I think it's really important that everyone undertaking exercise, whether you're an elite athlete or you're a recreational athlete, has that idea of their own risk. Because if that risk is high, then it will be very reasonable to get a more individualised personal approach to your exercise. In terms of when you're exercising, things to look out for, which are abnormal and sometimes associated with cardiac risk, are things like chest pain. Obviously, chest pain during exercise is abnormal. Things like undue breathlessness. The heart rate's really important as well. So if you know what your heart rate should be and you have a good feel for your heart rate, or depending on the level of intensity, then having something that's disproportionate for that level of exercise, irrelevant of how fit you are, should be a bit of a warning sign. If you have abnormal palpitations with a really high heart rate that's not coming down, at lower intensity of exercise, or anything associated with altered consciousness or altered awareness. So these are all sort of red flags for seeking advice.
I found it really interesting to talk to Dan and clear up my own understanding about what cholesterol is and the risks involved. I've always been aware, as Dan said, that lifestyle, diet can have an impact on healthy cholesterol levels, but I've never really delved into understanding the ins and outs. So to find out more about this, I reached out to dietitian and registered sports dietitian Nicole Rubenstein. She's familiar with helping riders fuel for performance, but also when health is a key priority. Nicole, thanks so much for speaking to me. I'm really interested to find out a bit more about cholesterol from a diet perspective, because it does seem like it's a slightly divisive topic. So I guess just starting from like the basics, how does diet impact your cholesterol levels?
Yeah, so there is some stuff that we know, and then of course a lot that we don't know. So if we did this interview in 20 years from now, we might have a lot more information, that kind of change the answers to some of these questions. But what we know right now is that certain types of dietary factors can both positively and negatively affect our cholesterol. So an example would be different types of fats in our diet. Saturated fat versus unsaturated fats can have differing effects on our cholesterol. But cholesterol is made by our liver. And so we have receptors in our liver that will produce cholesterol. And soluble or saturated fat, for example, can affect those receptors in our liver. So more saturated fat can increase LDL cholesterol, whereas things like soluble fiber coming from a lot of plant-based foods, that can actually help get rid of some of the cholesterol in our system. So those are kind of two different examples of dietary factors that could affect our cholesterol levels.
And what's the difference then to kind of like your saturated fats and your trans fats? Why are they kind of perceived as the ones you should like there's no question, it's something you should really try and avoid or reduce?
Yeah, so lots and lots of research on different types of fats, and saturated fat increases all the lipid levels. So if you go to your doctor and you get a lipid panel, two of the numbers that you'll see on there is the HDL, that's the good cholesterol, and the bad cholesterol is the LDL. So saturated fat is going to actually increase both of those. It's going to increase the bad, but it's also going to increase the good. Trans fat, on the other hand, is going to increase the bad and decrease the good. So it's exponentially worse. And because it's exponentially worse, a lot of companies have banned that from the food supply.
What about in the whole debate about full fat milk? Some say it's good, some say you should go for skimmed. Where's your opinion lie on that in terms of should we be reducing the fat content in terms of saturated fat in our diet, or should we be going for these full fat versions of what's available?
Yeah, so I think it depends on what we end up replacing it with. Fat helps to keep us feeling full and satiated. So if you completely eliminated fat from your diet, which would be next to impossible, but if you did, you would need something else to keep you feeling satiated. And so we have to think about, if we remove saturated fat, which is in full fat dairy, what are we replacing it with? And we're not getting much of a benefit from the fats necessarily in dairy. So if I'm working with someone that has less than desirable lipid profile and they're looking to lower their cholesterol and they do have a ton of fat from dairy in their diet, we will work on reducing it, but we're going to replace it with healthier fats, or we might replace it with high fiber plant-based foods. So it's all about what you end up replacing it with. If we just said, well, cut back on the eggs, cut back on the butter, don't have the white bread, our minds go to, what am I going to eat? I'm going to starve. So it's bringing more of that plant-based food in, and not processed plant-based foods like all the processed vegetarian proteins, but actual food. That would probably be the main thing, is look for the sources of saturated fat in your diet. Which ones might you be able to get rid of or reduce? And then how can you incorporate a lot more soluble fiber into your diet?
And just last question, Nicole, how effective do you think dietary intervention and making changes can be in lowering your own cholesterol levels, if it is something you're concerned of, or maybe it's something that's been flagged as an issue?
Quite a bit. So if you really work hard on it, it could be upwards of 20 to 30%, where we're significantly dropping saturated fat, eliminating trans fat, increasing soluble fiber, having more plant sterols in our diet, making sure that we are very active. So it could be upwards of 20 to 30%, which is quite a bit. And it can take a good 6 months or so. So if you are struggling with cholesterol and you really want to give it your all for 6 months, and then recheck your numbers and see where they're at.
It's good to hear how diets can have an impact and be pivotal in managing cholesterol, but also worth noting that any changes do take time and perseverance. Also, as Nicole says, this doesn't need to be just about taking away foods, but more swapping to better choices that still allow you to feel satisfied and satiated. What I think is also important to note is that for some, medical intervention is vital, especially considering genetic factors. My own takeaways are that unless you've been specifically advised by a medical professional, dietary cholesterol actually has a minimal effect on your blood cholesterol levels. As Nicole mentioned, it's a bit of a myth to consider things like eggs bad just because they contain cholesterol. What's in fact key is to focus on eating the right types of fat. Not cutting fat out totally, but focusing on unsaturated fats, the fats found in vegetables, nuts, seeds, and fish. It's these foods which can help to lower your bad LDL and raise your good HDL cholesterol. On the flip side, it is saturated fat that you should look to avoid. It's a high diet of this that can have an impact on your body's ability to take cholesterol out of the blood and into the liver to be broken down. There is research out there showing a continuous diet of saturated fat does lead to a buildup of cholesterol in the blood as a result. Another point Nicole made is to focus on fiber in the diet. It's something I hadn't considered before, but soluble fiber in things like oats, beans, lentils contains a type of fiber called beta-glucans, which is thought to form a gel around cholesterol, which stops it from being absorbed into the body, and it's excreted instead, which I think is another bonus point to porridge, my favourite. But of course, diet can only take things so far, and this is a point which Professor Augustine made abundantly clear.
So if you have high cholesterol and it's the wrong mix, then it really comes back to your own composition and risk factors. So actually, in the right person who's motivated, it can be relatively easy to switch things around if you're overweight with other risk factors like poorly controlled diabetes or high blood pressure through diet and lifestyle, and if necessary, medication. So you can have really good reversibility of abnormal lipid profiles in that scenario. At the other end of the spectrum, we do see really fit and healthy men and women who are younger who have high abnormal cholesterol profiles, and that's not to do with their diet and lifestyle, but that may have a genetic basis, and that needs a bit more thought in terms of how you approach their management, because the usual advice of increasing your aerobic exercise, cutting down your alcohol, probably doesn't apply to them. And so with that group, you probably are thinking more about medications, and actually medications in the right person, the right scenario, are really effective.
Yeah, because I was going to ask you that. Like, is this something that you really need to consider in terms of, is it a diet thing, or is medication kind of like a proven, safe, healthy way to tackle this?
So it depends. What I would sort of take one step back, and again, assuming that we're talking about an individual who hasn't had a stroke, who hasn't had a heart attack, I think the first thing is to look at what their risk is over 10 years. Okay. And that's what all the guidelines say. So you calculate something called your Q risk score. There are other risk scores, and see, is it over 10%? Is it less than 10%? If it's over 10%, then we know your risk is higher in the future, and we should be a bit more aggressive in terms of diet and lifestyle. And then if we haven't achieved that 40% reduction in that non-HDL cholesterol, the bad cholesterol, then we should think about treatment in terms of statins. And everything that we try and do within medicine is about risk benefit. And with any medication you take, there are going to be some side effects. But ultimately, if your risk is that high and we're not able to achieve a lower breakdown of cholesterol lipid profile with diet and lifestyle, then the benefits of medication outweigh the risk, which is going to be a vascular event.
Yeah, there's a lot at stake then, obviously.
Yeah, there is. Yeah.
I think my own key takeaways after trying to understand more about cholesterol is that above anything else, routine health checkups are vitally important, especially if you're over 40. Here in the UK, it's recommended that happens every 5 years, because as I've learned, you can be fit, healthy, active, and cholesterol can be something that does silently creep up on you. I feel relieved that my own cholesterol levels are fine, but still it could quite easily be something that affects me. But the positive thing, definitely, is that changes in diet or in terms of medical intervention in the form of medicine can be very effective in treating cholesterol levels if they are not on the good side. I also think it's worth noting that you really shouldn't beat yourself up if you do suffer from high cholesterol, because at the end of the day, this can happen to anyone, especially via the genetic lottery. But what is really key is that you should be aware of the risks, and you should be aware of the choices that you can make that can be potentially life-saving down the line. I really hope you found this video useful. I've learned so much delving into this topic. Do let us know in the comments section down below if you've suffered from this, and if riding potentially has helped it, and if you feel able to share any of your advice with the GCN community down below. Thanks for watching. See you on the next one. Take care out there, folks.